you do not really begin to live. You do not really begin to thrive and succeed until you can throw off the shackles of what others expect of you.
Welcome to the Smart Talk series, the show for professionals who want strategies, tips, and real talk about all things PR, marketing, and social media. Your host is Melissa Vella Williamson, an award-winning, accredited, and nationally recognized PR pro and communication thought leader. And now your host, Melissa Vella Williamson.
Hello and welcome to the Smart Talk series. I'm Melissa Vella Williamson. This season, our focus is on the future of mass communication. Today, I'm joined by Ruben Navarrette. Ruben Navarrete is a syndicated columnist with the Washington Post, writer of the Navarrete Nation newsletter at Substack, host of the podcast Ruben in the Center, and author of A Darker Shade of Crimson, Odyssey of a Harvard Chicano. He's also a storytelling coach specializing in brand development for individuals, companies, and nonprofit organizations. Welcome, Ruben.
Melissa, so good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I am so honored. You even took the time to respond back to my email asking if you'd be on the show and even talk to me, Ruben. I've read your columns for years now. Tell us more about how you got into this work, your background, and what you're doing today.
So, Melissa, thank you for that introduction. I like a lot of people who grew up in Generation X, I grew up in the 80s in college, high school and college, and everybody wanted to be a lawyer. There was a show on television called LA Law that had this historic figure, Victor Cifuentes, one of the first times we ever saw a Mexican-American lawyer on television. Mm-hmm. And so many of my fellow Mexican-American friends and I wanted to be lawyers, go into law. I did very well in high school. I grew up in Central California, the oldest of three kids. My mom was born in Texas, my dad in California. We all went to the same high school, all five of us. I graduated at the top of my class in 1985. I applied to a handful of schools. I got into Harvard. I went to Harvard with the intention of becoming a lawyer. And then somewhere along the line, after I took a lot of law-related jobs and internships and the like, my path crossed with the path of a writer. And it was just his encouragement. It's Richard Rodriguez, the essayist, who is a famous Mexican-American essayist and author. And just his encouragement of my writing was enough for me to make an important transition in my mind away from where I always thought I'd be, which is to become a lawyer, and really thinking about becoming a writer, communicator for a living. So that was the beginning of it. And from there, it's just been one long, wild ride.
And I love that you talk about, I didn't go to college with this idea in mind, and it was a smooth, linear path for me, because that's just the story I keep hearing over and over as I have these interviews, particularly from those of us who may be the first in our families to do this or that. But I think sometimes what I hear from professionals, there seems to be a little bit of shame, I just happened into this, and maybe that feeds into this overarching imposter syndrome we hear a lot about. But I just want to underscore for everyone that someone saw something in your writing and they encouraged you with that, and it became an idea for you and something that you identified with, obviously, and do very well at. But I just want us to take a moment and say, hey, have we encouraged anyone around us lately, particularly the next gen coming up after us, because that seems to be so important in our careers.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the imposter syndrome. It's a sense of sort of this accidental career. I think a lot of people, even if they're successful at what they're doing, they feel uneasy about taking credit for it. Most Mexican Americans, just speaking, from that subgroup, or Latinos in general, we have earned everything we have. We work hard. We have strong values. We are persistent. We persevere. We get knocked down and we get back up again. And so we deserve a lot more credit than we typically give ourselves. And I think the way you're right, that we frame that in our mind is somehow that all of our success is accidental. Either we don't deserve it, we haven't earned it, but all that's wrong. We have earned it. We do deserve it. And I always say that one area where I don't think Mexican Americans need any help at all is humility. If they had a humility Olympics, Mexican Americans would show up and win all the medals because we're that good at it. But as you learn, as you go through life, that is not always helpful toward a bigger success.
Absolutely. That's something that I write and speak about quite a bit. And I know you and I, when we first met, were talking about this, is that there's that dichotomy and the push and pull of that individualistic kind of American Western culture that some of our peers have. And, they're doing great. To win and play the system's game, you need to be able to take credit for your work. You need to be able to own your success in some ways, or in some ways state that you're going to be a success and work towards that. And I think with that pressure of us, particularly you said you're one of five, I'm one of five. And it really is hard to be a kid in a larger family where you can't really stick out too much, even for good reasons, because there's not always that capacity and bandwidth to give you the support and time and encouragement you need, even as a successful child. So I understand all that, and that's going to be a part of a lot of the work I write about too. Is particularly for Latinas, is to push yourself past what you're comfortable with and accept that that's just part of the journey. So I love that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I just quickly want to mention one thing you brought to mind: birth order. Birth order is something that's really important. It's interesting to explore it. If you're the firstborn, if you're the middle kid, if you're the baby of the family. I said I was a member of five because there's three kids and two parents, but my parents were each a part of five. So my dad was the baby of five, and my mom was the oldest of five. And I think throughout their marriage together and throughout sort of watching them and how they interact with themselves and the world, I never lost sight of that. It was always clear that my dad was raised as the baby and my mom was the oldest. And I am the oldest of three. And so I very much have certain attributes that the oldest tend to share. We have a sense of responsibility. We're the first one. We have to perform. We know we're setting the example. My younger brother gets to stretch out a little bit better, be much more creative, take chances. When you have your firstborn, as as a parent, you're still sort of like walking on the moon, trying to figure out parenthood. You're making all these mistakes. And by the time you have the third one, you've got it down to a science. So birth order is something very striking. I remember, just to wrap this up, I remember being at Harvard, and there was a class that I was in where birth order came up. And this was a huge class of about 1,000 people in a big auditorium. And I remember the professor saying, how many of you here as Harvard students are either the firstborn or the only child? And something like 80% of the hands went up. And we all looked at each other and laughed. And the point was that, typically when you're the firstborn or the only child, you're pushed harder and thought to be much more ambitious.
Or given that attention or support, because I'm going to advocate for us middle kids. I was right in the middle, 2 older brothers, 2 younger sisters.
Wow.
And then I was the last of my mom's first marriage, so the baby of that marriage, but the one that, really doesn't know my dad at all, my biological dad. And scrappy middle, trying to always fight for the attention, right? Because you're kind of doing just fine, which is actually an interesting segue to my next question, because, in my life, I've been certainly, and I think that's from family pressure and whatnot, of trying to stick out in a good way and get some of that time and attention and resources, is, being a little louder or a little judgier, which I tell aspiring pros and students, like, hey, if you've ever been called judgmental or judgy by your family, public relations may be a great industry for you, especially if you want to do good and make sure that people are being ethical and conscious of their decisions with what we do in the workplace and in society. But I love your role as an opinion columnist, because having an opinion is very different than publishing one in general, right? And have taken that time to craft out that opinion in writing. So, Ruben, being the most widely read Latino columnist in the country, how do you refine your opinion, particularly for writing, to be respected or taken in as it is today?
Right. That's a good point. I think one thing that sometimes holds Latinos back in this line of work, when I started writing a syndicated column for the Washington Post 24 years ago, there were 10 Latinos who were syndicated in the ranks of syndicated columnists. There were 10 of us, and then there became 5 of us. And now I think we're down to 4. It's a challenge, a very challenging piece of business for anybody, but particularly for Latinos, because we are raised from an early age to care a lot about what people say about us, what people think about us. I joke that one of the reasons when you have a protest and you have young white kids out at night, breaking out against, trying to break the window of the Starbucks downtown with their $300 skateboard. The reason you don't have Latinos out there is because we're afraid that we're going to be on television and, our comadre or tia, my grandmother's going to see me, and that's going to be the end of me. And so we are very conscientious of what people think about us and our town and our family and our neighborhood. And it is, this is a difficult job to do if you worry about what people think about you. If I go around thinking I have to persuade you to my opinion, if I go around thinking that you have to like me, if I go around thinking you have to respect me, if your opinion or the opinion of 62 million Latinos in this country is really important to me, I'm not going to last 24 minutes, let alone 24 years. You don't have to be a jerk about it, but you need to understand that you do not really begin to live, you do not really begin to thrive and succeed until you can throw off the shackles of what others expect of you. And sometimes it's our family or our parents or whatever, but we are sometimes our own worst enemies. And I'm always struck by that. My brother was at an event once. He works in Hollywood for a media company, and it was an event and somebody recognized his last name, and they said, "Oh yeah, your brother, the writer." And this was a well-meaning Mexican American woman who asked him, "I have to ask you a question. I've been reading your brother for years. Does he care what people say about him?" And my brother smiled and said, "Not at all, not even a little bit." So I think that's another thing that holds us back. Our humility tends to hold us back. Our fear of how we're perceived tends to hold us back. But to answer the question directly, in terms of how you shape an op-ed that's, for lack of a better word, respected, you've got to think before you write. The worst advice you can give anybody is just sit at your computer and start typing. No. Before you ever think about your op-ed, write your op-ed, you got to think about it. Think it through and visualize it in your head. It's going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's what points do you want to make? What points do you want to be sure to make in the body of it? How do you write the first 25 words so it's really enticing and grabbing? And how do you write the last, 10 to 20 words in a way that leaves an impression on the reader? And so by the time I actually turn on the computer and start to write, I've got this outline on paper or in my head. And so that's really the best advice I can give to people is think before you write, try not to be predictable, try to challenge the reader, surprise the reader, and don't be afraid to be complicated. Grandma was a very complicated person, okay? And I don't mean my grandma. I mean your grandma. I mean all of our grandmas. All of our abuelas were complicated people. They were liberal in some respects and conservative in other respects. They were not easily pigeonholed in a focus group. And that is how our 62 million Latinos are. We're very beautiful and complicated and complex people. So my advice to people is always lean into that. Show me through your writing just how complex and complicated we are.
Yeah, that's what I really enjoy about your columns and a few others columnists that I track with is they give you just a rounder picture, a more 3D picture of what the topic is, what we're talking about, because people are multifaceted. Things more and more as I age and I do this work in PR, it's a case-by-case situation. It's a person by person. It's a season by season sometimes, day by day. Sometimes.
Yeah, right.
And, the pandemic years, it was like an hour by hour situation. So I think if we try to categorize so cleanly these really important issues, it's never as neat as what we want it to be. And in positive ways, I often see the data shows, and I love it when you all, really work that data over to bring it to light in your columns, that a lot of people live in that messy middle.
Right.
It just depends. It depends on the candidate. It depends on what they're saying, what they're writing, what the message is. Sometimes each little term or word is going to just resonate with people across demographic boundaries, old stereotypes, and whatnot. So I love that you bring that up for sure. Well, you really do cover some really important topics. How do you approach which topics to cover for your column?
So that's a really good question. Over the years, and I've been doing this a long time, over 4,000 columns and essays, and op-eds over the years. And I've made a lot of mistakes and trying to learn from those mistakes. And sometimes the mistake I made was picking the wrong topic for that particular day or week. It may have been something that I had been thinking about for a while, and I really wanted to get off my chest. But it was the wrong topic because it wasn't in the public mainstream. It wasn't something that people were talking about that day. I think when you sign on to Twitter, you see what's trending for the day. Long before we had Twitter, long before we had that, we still had trending. And what that means is that what topics are people talking about this week? And good training for this. Before I was ever a writer, I was a radio talk show host. I hosted radio shows in 5 different cities, but I started in Los Angeles when I was 26 years old as the co-host of a nighttime radio show. My co-host was Tavis Smiley, who remains a good friend of mine, and we've been friends for over 30 years. And we would get together 2 hours before we went on air. We went on air at 9 o'clock, and we would get together at 7 in the green room, and we would hash out topics. And we would say, okay, what are we going to talk about today? And what we were looking for was, what's the talker? What's the topic that you're going to get lots of calls about and lots of different opinions, and people are going to be interested and engaged? What's the topic that's going to light people on fire? And just from the day's news. And so that was excellent training for writing a column, because now I look at the topics. Melissa, I normally have, when I start on a Monday morning, I have maybe 20 topics to choose from that are happening just that week on all different fronts, foreign policy to domestic policy, whatever might be happening on the border in our schools or whatever. And so from taking in all this media, I might have 20 to 30 topics to choose from. But ultimately, what I'm looking for are the topics that people are talking about at the water cooler, are debating at the kitchen table. And I'll just wrap up with this. I remember my wife giving me a great piece of advice. My column is just a little bit older than my marriage, but just by a bit. I've been married for 21 years, and I remember my wife telling me at one point, "Don't overthink this. This isn't a science. Don't sit and try to focus group this in your mind and pick the topic that you think you should write about. Just think about the one thing that's happening in the world that you can't wait to share with me when you get home from the day. As we come home and we're cooking dinner, there's this one topic you want to share with me. This cool book, movie, study thing that you heard about. That should be your topic." And it was really good advice, and I've stuck with it for the most part. That's where I choose my topics.
I love that. And I love that your wife helped shape your paradigm on how you viewed this, because there is that push, right? I was just listening to a podcast, and Brene Brown was talking about how it seems like we have like this scarcity culture now. That's different than a mindset. It's more of like, really, she was saying since 9/11, a real fear in the U.S., a real never enoughness. And when it comes to things like being a columnist, or you've got this pressure now that maybe when you started wasn't necessarily there. Like, do you have enough followers? Are they engaging with your materials online? Are they clicking them? Are they liking them? Are they sharing them? Right?
Yeah.
And yes, like you said, Ruben, like you worked maybe to have a little bit of insulation of like, I'm not going to focus on that outside feedback in some ways. I'm going to say what needs to be said, look it up, stand by it, right? But at the same time, I think there's a lot of pressure, and I even see it in my field of, you wanted to go where the current's really flowing, where things are popular. So you could be writing a column, every week about Taylor Swift. So I want to also honor that you're still really thinking about significant topics. And I think that really helps our country, because most of what I don't love how we went from this microwave society to this TikTok society, and these little bites of information that are not exactly accurate sometimes. And so I stand by the work you're doing to pick important issues and topics.
So for Brene Brown, I become a fan of Brene Brown. She's a very important thinker and speaker. She has an excellent gift for communicating. My wife is a speech and language pathologist, an SLP, and speech therapist. And in her studies in graduate school, she became aware of Brene Brown, and we saw a Netflix special, and I was just hooked and so interested in what she does. But here's the significant takeaway about Brene Brown. One of the brilliant parts of her is that she embraces, as you said, life's a mess. that we used the word messy, you and I, a second ago, in terms of talking about the Latino community and how complex we are. But life is also messy. And she embraces that. And when I listen to her podcast, it's just a mess. It's kind of all over the place. And in the best sense of the word, because when I speak to my friends who are devotees of Brene Brown, who have all her books, they can relate to that, right? And when I got that, it was like a lightning bolt, Melissa. It was just like, there are times where you wake up, you have 2 Harvard degrees, and you still feel dumb, right?
Yeah.
It just felt like I didn't get that until that moment when I realized that what people appreciate is the fact that she is so realistic and so relatable. And I thought, imagine if you're a syndicated columnist who is realistic and relatable. You're going to do so much better in every aspect of your career than if you are above an ivory tower and you say things that people can't relate to or apply to their lives. So that's an important takeaway. I've become a big fan of Brene Brown for that reason. Quickly on Taylor Swift, I used a column. I just entered the competition for the Pulitzer Prize last week, as I do almost every year, unless I'm judging, which I've had the chance to do. And one of the columns I chose, you get to choose 7 columns from the year, and I chose a column that I wrote about my 14-year-old daughter, me, Taylor Swift, and Bruce Springsteen. And what the column was about was my daughter at 14, big Swiftie, and she was loving a lot of Taylor Swift's lyrics from her folklore album. And she turned me on to it. And I said to her, I really love the writing. As a writer, I really appreciate the writing. She's obviously a great songwriter. And I said, oh, but if you like good songwriting, here, let me show you something. So I pulled up the lyrics to Thunder Road from Springsteen, played it for her, had her follow the lyrics, and she looked back and said, wow, that's really great. And so I wrote a column about how it is that a father was able to bond with his 14-year-old daughter over song lyrics by Taylor Swift and Bruce Springsteen. Melissa, I've written 4,000 columns, okay? But I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to forget that one, okay? I got mail from all over. I got people, Melissa, who are sick and tired of politics. If they hear the name Donald Trump one more time, they're going to scream. And they love that column. They love about it. I heard from fathers. I heard from daughters. I heard from songwriters. That, to my mind, is a hole-in-one. And I don't care what they're teaching at Harvard or the Kennedy School of Government about, how to write hoity-toity columns. When you can speak, as Brene Brown does, to somebody's heart like that through a column, it doesn't get any better than that.
I love it. Ruben, we're going to soften you up. That's what I'm coming away with. Well,
that's what daughters are here for. That's why God gave me 2 daughters and a son, so my daughters could soften me up.
Yeah, and I think it's so people do want someone to relate to, and I have to think about that too. Is that because of my training and my background, I want things to be very polished, and even the podcast edited and clean, easy to listen to, and I'm trying to embrace what. Right. Sometimes good enough is good enough, and it's appreciated as such because it's more relatable. So I love that. And when we can tie pop culture to things, it really helps people, I think, understand and connect, because I do work in diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And a lot of times my approach is more of that unifying, in the middle, bridge building point of view, which is look, find what your common points are, find what you agree on. Most people can find something. Pop culture crosses boundaries of what your ethnic background is and what your socioeconomic situation is and whatnot, right? We say Taylor Swift, probably everybody here knows who we're talking about, right? It doesn't matter what their background is. And they probably all have some kind of interesting story or opinion about her or music, whatnot. So I love that example. And damn it, I hope you win that Pulitzer, and I hope it's with that column right there.
Yeah.
Very awesome.
I know that one thing you've mentioned before is community, and the sense of community and the idea of the collective versus the individual. Latinos are very much from a collective society, but we have become much more individual as we lived longer and longer in this country. And the shared experience of the Super Bowl or Taylor Swift or any of these things that brings us together as Americans, that's really, really important. It goes way beyond football and pop stars.
Yep.
It goes to, it's any kind of unifying message.
You write about important issues like immigration in America. what would you want PR professionals or communicators to know about the immigration debate?
Well, yeah, I appreciate the question. The immigration debate is, I think, the most divisive issue the country has faced since slavery. It's also one of the most dishonest debates. There are lots of lies flying up in the air, the lies that we tell ourselves about how it is that we're the ones who hire immigrants, our dependence on immigrants, our addiction to immigrant labor, the same things we complain about we can't live without as Americans. So I think that's the first thing that needs to be put on the table. One of the reasons that the debate is so divisive and the issue seems so unsolvable is because it starts from a point of dishonesty. We can't really begin to tackle any problem unless you're honest about the roots of the problem and how we got here and where we go from here. Now, I should say at the beginning, I'm not an expert. I tell groups all the time when I speak, I'm not an expert on immigration because I'm not an immigrant. I was born in the United States, and both my parents were born in the U.S., and 3 of my 4 grandparents were born in the U.S. The 4th came, my dad's dad, Ruben Navarrette, that came from Chihuahua during the Mexican Revolution. He came legally because nobody could come illegally until after 1924, after the revolution was well over. And I say I'm not really an expert on immigration because when I listen to my friends who are immigrants and who came to this country, they were born somewhere else and they came here, they really understand the nuts and bolts of the immigration system so much better than we do as U.S.-born citizens, where we take our citizenship for granted. And one of those people is, for instance, my wife, who was born in Guadalajara and who came to the United States legally as a child with her family. And even though she did come legally, she has members of her family who we may say could be undocumented, maybe undocumented. And see, she is so much closer to the immigration issue than I am as a U.S. citizen. And so I defer oftentimes when I speak to immigrant groups. I'll listen to what they're saying. I think that people who come here from someplace else have an understanding of our country that sometimes rivals what Americans think, because for us it's normal. And we take things like citizenship for granted. And, one funny example of this, my wife tells me, and almost every foreign-born person I've spoken to, no matter what country they come from, they'll tell you that they know exactly where their passport is because they have a foreign passport and then a U.S. passport, and they became U.S. citizens and they went through the whole process. They know exactly what their passport is. They keep all their documents in order. I can't tell you the number of U.S. citizens, me included, who don't know where our documents are. Where's my birth certificate? Where's my original Social Security card? Where's my passport? Part of being born in the United States is having the luxury of ignorance about certain things, and that's one of them.
It's tough. Yeah, I'm here in Texas. I grew up in Texas. We've got our immigration story. And what I think part of that I wanted to bring up for professional communicators is, again, thinking about that unifying thread, right? What is that through line in these conversations? And even an issue as tricky as that is, how universal is migration? It's completely natural. It's completely natural to animals. It's completely natural to people to move around where you'll be successful or you fit in better to an environment. We do that with our jobs. We do that with our homes. We do that with geography. But with systems and rules, and a lot of them that hopefully with different policies and individuals in time will be changed, then it becomes so polarizing and it becomes all these pointy fingers. But really at the core, I think people understand why somebody might want to immigrate, be an immigrant or come to this country or migrate or whatnot. And I think sometimes we lose that humanity. So I just want to bring that up for those who might need to communicate about this space, is just think about that humanizing factor and how you can be respectful in the conversations.
And I think there's 2 things that PR professionals can do there. One is you and I, we could both make lists about what's good about immigration. If you were speaking to a group of people and you wanted to, instead of, make them angry, as our politicians tend to do, or to incite passions, but if you wanted to really get them to calm down and appreciate the beauty of America's immigrant tradition and our tradition of asylum, for instance, giving asylum to people who are fleeing persecution of some kind, you can make a list. What's 10 good things about immigration? What kind of things do you think would resonate with the audience? It brings new blood. It preserves the American brand of being a refuge or a haven for people who have no options. This is the country of second chances. You come here because it didn't work out in the home country, and you forge a new, life, and you salute the flag, and you have a new allegiance, and it's a beautiful story that keeps repeating itself. The other thing that PR professionals can do is think about sort of the bullet points for how immigration can bring people together. There's something counterintuitive, right? I just said this was the most divisive issue in America since slavery. What if it is also an issue that can bring people together? Well, how do you do that? What's the capability there for immigration and the immigration debate to actually bring people together? And if you solve that, you're making big strides in PR and journalism and public policy all at once. So I think that there's always an opportunity, because when people get too much of one thing, as you know, they then begin to crave the opposite. And we have had a lot of division. We don't have a lot of empathy. We distrust each other's motives. We have a broken conversation in America. Even Latinos, even members of our own family, we, do not dialogue well, or the American conversation is broken. And so for professional communicators in PR and journalism, how do we use the immigration issue to actually fix the conversation?
Yeah, I love that. Or even that approach of just trying to focus on that commonality. I think that keeps coming up, right? Getting in the middle, getting in community, finding that unifying factor can really be a smart decision. On that note of divisiveness and different opinions and whatnot, I really love, Ruben, how you kind of turn the table over and say, let's look at it in this way. So it's a presidential election year, and of course there's opinions everywhere. What do you know that may be surprising to professionals regarding what the data says about people like Latinos, what they may or may not do when it comes to picking a party, a candidate, voting? Is there any surprises for us that we should think about?
Yeah, and if we just look at Latinos, we are a community that's very interesting. They said 62 million people. We are the largest group of potential voters, because we have of all the various groups with the most number of people over 18 who are eligible to vote. In 2020, we reached a high point of, I think, about 16 million people who voted. The 12 to 16 million, different figures I've seen. And so on the one hand, we are hyper activated in terms of participating in our democracy. On the other hand, we are divided by many different things, Melissa, by generations, by levels of education, by rural versus urban, by geography and where we live. A Mexican American who lives in a red state like Texas might see things differently than one who lives in a blue state like California, probably will. So we're divided all those different ways. There are gender differences. You see how men are much more supportive of Donald Trump than Latinas are, women are. So all these things come into play, and they do provide some surprising results. And one of them is, as I mentioned before, Donald Trump, for his very blatant attempts to score points on the backs of Latinos and hoist Latinos up as a piñata and take shots at Latinos as a way of ginning up support from white people. Having said all that, he does very well with Latinos, and he has done better every single time he's been on the ballot. And this time around, I expect him to do even better and probably hit that magic number, which is 40% of the Latino vote, which is really rarefied air, because it represents where Ronald Reagan was in 1984. It's hard to really explain to people how much support Reagan had among Latinos in 1984, but it was 40%. George W. Bush, 20 years later in 2004, got 44% of the Latino vote. Incredible. And now in that club, you may have someone like Donald Trump, who I think doesn't really deserve to be in the club, but he may well be. So this is all in the mix. There are definite reasons why Trump appeals to Latinos and Latino men in particular. But you really have to start with the fact that we have not been well served by the Democratic Party and not well served by the Biden administration. And so that support that Biden enjoyed from Latinos, only 61%. In fact, it was never that high, but about 61% is now is now dissipated. So that's where we are. We're a complicated group of people. We're hard to predict and hard to explain. We're peculiar sometimes in the way we cast our ballots, but we're very independent minded, and we tend to surprise people.
Yeah, I remember reading one of my first columns that talked about that linkage, because there is that, I think, thought that, well, Latinos are going to all vote Democrat and people of color all vote Democrat, and this is the way it is, right? And this is the way it's always going to be. Well, you have to go back and look at the data. We can't just go by what used to be or our intuition or feelings when it comes to matters like this. So I think I was surprised in that. And then I have my own, thoughts of, okay, what's resonated, what's not. And a lot of it, if we think about it as professional communicators, has to do with, well, what was that tagline for the campaign? And some of the research I've read about, like, it was that Make America Great Again just really resonated with folks in a time where they felt like things were not fair and it used to be different. It used to be better. And we hear that about different generations as they age. And now I'm, starting to be like, well, in my day, right, I'm doing it too already with my parenting and my kids. So, gosh, as communicators, I just want us to think about, maybe it's not as clear and as easily cut as we think about it, or it used to be, but what's the reality now? We need to do that extra step to think about what the reality now is. And then go one other step, especially if you're those who are working in public affairs or governmental relations, or those who want to help organize and get more people to vote, is just because people have opinions doesn't mean they do anything with them. So I really want to just champion that middle ground of like, hey, you've got choice, go make your choice be heard. And that's something that is, I think, a big gap is, how do we convert these thoughts and polls into actual voting and actual movement? And so that is, for me, what I hope people focus on if they're in this space, for sure.
Yeah,
Ruben,
young people. And we see now that young people are very activated, that Generation Z is sort of determined to have its voice heard. Sometimes it's happening on college campuses. People who study generations for a living, written books about the subject, really see a strong level of social participation. You're going to see voting. It's a bit strange for me as a member of Generation X, a much more jaded, cynical generation that never saw government work much in our lifetime. That's not true for Generation Z. That as they start out, they are optimistic that they want to make a change. They think voting is part of that. So that's a very good and healthy trend. But we are a complicated community. As I said, we have all these different divisions going through us. And the important thing, no matter what age you are, is as Latinos to stay informed of the issues, ask lots of questions, think critically, and don't let any political party either write you off or take you for granted. And that's been a challenge for Latinos.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, quit talking, start doing. And so taking those actions by voting and getting involved, particularly at the local level, because so much of our lives are really impacted by our local government and the rules and policies there. So definitely want to underline that, double click on that, Ruben. Well, I know you and I, just so our listeners have a little sneak peek heads up, I know you and I are very interested in doing a webinar together, and we'll get into some of the nitty gritty about pitching columnists like yourself and how to write a great op-ed for another day in a webinar. So I'm going to just get us to the end here, since I know you are a very busy person. Ruben, I want to ask you, because I really like having these kind of conversations, what does smart talk mean to you?
For me, I think smart talk is being able to challenge yourself, look at any issue from a 360-degree perspective. I try to raise my 3 teenagers to think that there's no one right answer on any of these issues, gun control, abortion, immigration, that these are complicated, sticky issues that have been with us for a long time, precisely because there's no one right answer. I think that when people are opinionated, there's a tendency to run toward their opinion, stay there, and not shake off from that. And I respect people who say, I used to think this about same-sex marriage, but I was wrong, and now I think this. Or I used to support the death penalty, and now I'm opposed to it. Even some Mexican Americans I'm hearing from who have changed their view on immigration They used to be much more supportive of it, and now they're much more concerned about what's happening on the border. So I want to see that evolution of thought. For me, smart talk is that you're constantly reassessing, processing new information. You're not afraid to say you were wrong and to make a U-turn and come back and change your perspective. I know some very bright, brilliant people who would, to my mind, have remained smarter had they not gotten into politics. And I can think of two in particular. One's a hardcore Democrat, one's a hardcore Republican. They're both, brand names, well-known establishment figures in their own respective party. But in talking to them, it's impossible to get the Democrat to say anything nice about Republicans. It's impossible to get the Democrat to acknowledge that Republicans do anything right. And likewise with the Republican, it's impossible to get him to acknowledge the Democratic Party does anything right. So ergo, I think that both these people that I'm thinking about went to Harvard and other good schools, but that doesn't make you smart. What makes you smart is being able to see things from another perspective. And politics, unfortunately, is the enemy of that. It's a lot of my friends who went into that line of work, they're so pigeonholed in what they believe that it just gets boring listening to them because they can't think outside the box. I don't want blue. I don't want red. I want purple. My podcast is Ruben in the Center because, I'm really sick of both parties. And if you're paying attention, I'm sorry, but if you're a Latino, you care about our community, you care about the United States of America, you cannot tell me the political parties have been a good and positive influence in this country. And so, you should be like me. You should look at the Republicans and Democrats and say, at this point, I really hate them both. I really think neither political party is done right by the Latino community and by Americans in general. And you can love politics and still think the political parties are not helpful because they're pretty much only out for themselves. So my definition of smart talk is that you're constantly challenging yourself. You're able to communicate effectively. You're thinking critically, and you're, what did we say before? Embracing the mess. If you and I had a podcast together, or I did a live show together, I'd love to call it the mess. We talked about it with regard to how messy Latinos are. We talked about it with regard to Brene Brown. America is a mess. Our lives are messy. You have to embrace the mess, and I think that's very much alive in our politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just also add that I think we think about all these things, just remembering as humans, as people, that some of this polarization is strategic. And often a lot of it is. And it's just sometimes when it comes to politics and how people really just dig into that, it's like, with this kind of, like you were saying about the colleagues with this kind of opinion, be okay if you were thinking or having that opinion of another group or type of person. Like we can't let this be. It's just another form of otherism that somehow seems acceptable because it seems like it's a game, right? But this is not a game that we win if we play. So I just want to underline that too. Well, thanks so much, Ruben. What's the best way our listeners can connect with you to just learn more about your opinions and some of the great ideas you share for them to think about?
I'm really enjoying my newsletter at Substack. There's 3 subscribers get 3 bursts a week. The first one is a big ranging newsletter, about 3,000 words with a bunch of different things in it, including a lengthy monologue. The third one is a bonus column on Friday, but on Wednesdays, I do a journos journal. So it's much more personal, much more I, me, my. It's about me or my kids or my wife or my family, and about different things that I'm thinking about. And so people can reach me at Substack, and people can check in at rubennavarrette.com. They can follow me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. But the best thing about a lot of the media work I'm doing right now, Melissa, is my kids help me with it. I have a 16-year-old son who helps me by recording the videos that I do for a company called Straight Arrow News, weekly videos, video commentary. And then I have my 18-year-old daughter who's a freshman in college, and she edits my Substack. So it's great. It's a family affair, and they make me better, and they've given me a nice little window into Generation Z. I don't always understand it, but I'm intrigued by it.
I love it. That's great. And they're learning with you and they're getting that experience. So that's fantastic. Well, thank you, Ruben. This has been so enlightening, and we appreciate your sharing your knowledge with us today.
Melissa, thank you so much. I appreciate what you do. Look forward to speaking with you again.
Thanks to our listeners for joining me for today's episode. If you like Smart Talk and strategic comms, let's collaborate. You can work with me as a trainer, a consultant, or hire my firm, MVW Communications, for strategic comms planning or PR strategy services. My book, Smart Talk, Public Relations Essentials All Pros Should Know, is available on Amazon in print or audio and offers advice, how-to tips, tools, and new PR models so aspiring and practicing pros are equipped for this evolving field. Please follow and rate this podcast if you're a fan, and follow us at MVW to get the latest on trends, trainings, and more. And as always, think smart and communicate smart. And I'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Smart Talk series. If you learned something or enjoyed our conversation, share it on social media or send to a friend. To learn more about this and other communication topics, visit mvw360.com. That's mvw360.com.